The year is 1370. Imagine yourself standing on the battlements of your beloved city. You are a soldier, heart pounding beneath your worn leather armor, sweat stinging your eyes. You've heard the whispers carried on the Silk Road winds, tales that curdle the blood of every man, woman, and child from Persia to the Hindu Kush. They speak of entire civilizations annihilated. They recount rivers that ran crimson for days. They describe grotesque monuments, not to the dead, but built from the remains of the conquered. And now, the source of those nightmares, the unstoppable, brutal force, is at your gates. Your commander, a veteran of countless sieges, stares into the dust-choked horizon and makes an impossible choice: surrender. The conqueror has sent a messenger, a promise sworn on his own immortal honor. He guarantees mercy. He gives his solemn, binding oath that upon opening the gates, not a single drop of your blood will be shed. You lay down your sword, you open the massive city doors, and in that moment, the terrifying truth of the monster standing before you is revealed. You realize the terrible final mistake you have been made. This man, this chillingly brilliant warlord, is a man of his word, but his word is a deadly trap. Within hours, you and thousands of your comrades are rounded up, disarmed, and marched to pits that have been hastily dug outside the city walls. These are no ordinary graves. These are vast, deep trenches, and as the conqueror's men shove you over the edge, you understand the terrible technicality of his promise. You are being buried alive. The rough soil hits your face. You scream, but the sound is muffled, choked by the earth that pours down, heavier and faster than any flood. You struggle, suffocating, the darkness and the immense crushing weight of the soil pressing in on you until the last flicker of life is gone. Not a sword touched you, not an arrow flew. Technically, not a drop of your blood was spilled. This chilling historical account is just the beginning. The man who ordered this act did not stop there. This monster, this architect of calculated horror, would go on to orchestrate the slaughter of an estimated 17 million people, construct grotesque, towering pyramids from the severed heads of his enemies, and commit acts of such disturbing, personalized cruelty that even hardened medieval chroniclers confessed they became physically ill and mentally overwhelmed, unable to finish documenting the atrocities. If you are fascinated by the absolute darkest, most unforgiving corners of history, the parts that textbooks sanitize or simply ignore, then you need to hit that subscribe button right now. We delve into these brutal truths and explore the psychology of the monsters who actually lived. Seriously, drop a like, because the following chapters of this man's life are going to reveal a level of cruelty you never thought possible. You absolutely need to hear what happened to the fifth city. It operates on a completely different level of vengeance.
His name was Tamerlane, or Timur the Lame, and his campaign against 5 major cities transforms every other conqueror in history into an amateur. This is not just a story of mass murder. It is the definitive account of calculated cruelty taken to its absolute, systematic extreme. What you are about to witness is going to stay with you long after this video ends. Before we plunge headlong into the nightmares he orchestrated, we must understand the man himself. Timur was no wild, mindless barbarian brandishing a rusty blade. Born in 1336 in what is now modern Uzbekistan, Timur rose from minor tribal nobility to become one of the most intellectually gifted and militarily successful conquerors the world has ever known. The name Tamerlane came later, a corruption of Timur Timur the Lame, after an injury in a battle or skirmish left him with a lifelong limp. He was a brilliant military strategist and tactician, a cunning political operator, a dedicated patron of the arts who commissioned stunning architecture, and a highly educated man who could converse fluently and even recite complex epic poetry in multiple languages. This unsettling blend of refined genius and utter savagery is precisely what makes his legacy so profoundly disturbing. He aggressively claimed descent from the great Genghis Khan, viewing it as his divine life's mission to reconstruct the shattered Mongol Empire. But while Genghis Khan used terror effectively as a necessary tool of war, Tamerlane elevated terror to a formalized, systemic art form. His core goal was fundamentally different from most historical military leaders. Most conquerors desired to rule the lands they took. They needed the cities to remain intact, the peasant populations alive to work the fields and pay taxes, and the economic infrastructure functioning to fund their expanding empires. Tamerlane fundamentally did not care about preservation. For Timur, mere political submission was insufficient. If a city dared to resist him, or if, far worse, a city rebelled after offering its initial surrender and accepting his temporary mercy, he demanded total, irreversible retribution. He didn't just punish them, he made them cease to exist as a cultural or political entity. He achieved this through a meticulous, creative, and systematic brutality that ensured his horrific reputation preceded his armies. Entire cities, hearing the fresh accounts of what happened to those who chose defiance, would immediately throw open their gates and surrender, which was the entire point of his grim strategy. Fear was his most effective and least costly soldier, and he fueled that fear with unparalleled, organized brutality.
The sheer scope of his destruction is a number the human mind struggles to process. In the course of just 35 years of relentless conquest, spanning from 1370 to his death in 1405, historians estimate that Tamerlane's campaigns may have resulted in the deaths of up to 17 million people. To contextualize this staggering figure, the entire estimated global population at the time hovered around 365 million. That means Tamerlane was potentially responsible for eliminating nearly 5% of every human being alive on Earth during his lifetime. Ponder that figure. 1 in every 20 people who existed died because of his single ambition. While historians inevitably debate and adjust these massive medieval body counts, even if we conservatively have that figure, we are still discussing mass death on a scale that beggars the imagination. This was not the indiscriminate violence of a natural disaster or a plague. This was deliberate, personal, methodical, and calculated extermination. So, how exactly did he manage to terrify entire civilizations? What specific, inventive acts of horror made the very mention of his name a chilling word of caution from Persia to Russia? Let us explore. Be warned once more, these 5 acts of atrocity will escalate in their disturbing detail. Our dive into Tamerlane's methods begins in the fateful year 1400 at the strategic city of Sivas, nestled in what is now central Turkey. At this time, Sivas was under the jurisdiction of the emerging Ottoman Empire and was defended by a staunch garrison, a significant portion of which was composed of local Armenian Christians. By 1400, Tamerlane's fearsome reputation had already traveled across the entire known world.
every soldier defending the ramparts knew the horrifying tales of the cities that had been systematically wiped out, the populations brutally massacred, and the unbelievable cruelties reserved for those who dared to draw a sword against him. When Tamerlane's vast army appeared on the horizon, the defenders of Sivas faced a desperate and impossible equation: fight to the last and surely die, or surrender and face an uncertain, horrifying death. The siege began, and the garrison resisted fiercely, holding out for as long as their dwindling supplies and hope allowed. It was then that Tamerlane, ever the master of psychological warfare, sent a message that seemed too humane to be true. He offered them an escape route. The message to the defenders was clear: surrender now, and I give you my solemn, personal promise. Not a single drop of your blood will be shed.
This was never just about punishing the soldiers of Sivas. It was about creating an inescapable psychological scar that would spread like a wildfire across every city, every fortress, and every kingdom in Tamerlane's path. The message was devastatingly simple. Surrender offers no safety. Mercy is a mirage. Promises are word games. And Tamerlane is always, ruthlessly, thinking 3 steps ahead of you. The news of Sivas spread with lightning speed. Suddenly, every city, every commander had to brutally recalculate their odds. Perhaps fighting to the absolute last breath was the better choice. At least a man would die with a weapon in his hand rather than dirt choking his lungs. Or perhaps immediate total surrender was the only true hope. This is what made Tamerlane so utterly terrifying. He wasn't merely a successful conqueror. He was a psychological architect, meticulously constructing structures of paralyzing fear deep within the minds of his future enemies. And Sivas, the scene of the bloodless execution, was merely his devastating opening act. If you thought burying 4,000 men alive was the height of his cruelty, you must hear what he did to the cities that actually dared to defy him. If Sivas was a lesson in twisted promises, then what Tamerlane inflicted upon the city of Urgench was something entirely different. A deliberate, systematic attempt to make a place and its entire civilization vanish from the face of the earth as though it had simply never existed. Urgench was one of the undisputed jewels of Central Asia. Situated strategically in what is now Turkmenistan, it was a thriving nexus along the critical Silk Road trade routes and served as the proud capital of the Khwarezmian region. It was incredibly wealthy, immensely cultured, filled with renowned libraries, magnificent mosques, bustling complex markets, and beautiful ornate homes. By all accounts, it was a place worth capturing and ruling. But Urgench committed a fatal, catastrophic mistake. It rebelled. Rebellions were a common feature of life within medieval empires. Typically, a conqueror would arrive, swiftly crush the uprising, execute the clear ringleaders, perhaps commit a few strategic acts of terror to make a point, and then swiftly return to the essential business of collecting taxes. After all, you need your cities intact and functioning to generate the revenue that funds your vast empire, right? Not Tamerlane. For him, an act of rebellion was not a simple political problem that required a calculated solution. It was a profound personal insult that necessitated total and irreversible retribution. In 1388, after Urgench had dared to openly resist his authority, Tamerlane returned with a massive, focused army. This was no longer a military siege in the traditional sense. This was to be a state-sanctioned execution, not just of people, but of the city's very existence. His forces surrounded Urgench and began the methodical, crushing attack. The defenders fought with desperate valor, but they were facing the most efficient and terrifying military machine the world had ever witnessed.
City walls that had proudly stood for centuries were quickly breached. And then the true horror was unleashed.
This leads to a chilling question. What happened when a city was intelligent enough to surrender immediately, to offer no resistance whatsoever? Would Tamerlane finally show genuine mercy? The great Persian city of Isfahan was about to provide the answer, an answer that would result in one of the single most horrifying episodes recorded in all of medieval history. Isfahan was undeniably one of the greatest cities of medieval Persia, a renowned global center of magnificent art, advanced science, and profound Islamic scholarship. When Tamerlane's overwhelming army approached its walls in 1387, the city's wise leaders chose what appeared to be the only rational option. They surrendered immediately. There was no resistance, no defiant siege. They opened their gates, laid down their available weapons, and submitted entirely to his will. And initially, astonishingly, Tamerlane appeared to show mercy. He did not initiate a massacre. He installed a token garrison in the city, appointed his own administrative officials, and imposed a heavy tax on the citizens to fund his continuous military campaigns. It was an entirely standard procedure for a military occupation. Isfahan had seemingly made the only correct choice. They were going to survive the onslaught. For a few short tense weeks, life under Tamerlane's rule was grudgingly bearable. Yes, there were foreign soldiers patrolling the streets, and the new taxes were exorbitant, but the key fact remained: everyone was alive. The magnificent buildings still stood. Children still played in the squares. The markets, though subdued, were still open for business. But then, the people of Isfahan made a fundamental, catastrophic miscalculation. They grew deeply angry about the crushing taxes, and that anger rapidly spiraled into a full-scale rebellion. It likely began small, grumbling in the spice markets, angry complaints about the occupiers. But it quickly and violently escalated. Citizens began assaulting Tamerlane's hated tax collectors. Then they turned their full fury on his soldiers. In a fully coordinated and successful uprising, the people of Isfahan managed to kill the entire garrison Tamerlane had left behind. Word of this stunning, defiant act reached Tamerlane, and those who understood his unique psychology knew instantly: Isfahan had just sealed its own final death warrant. Here is the key to Tamerlane's unique brand of terror. You could fight him from the very start, and in a twisted way he might respect it. He would destroy you, but that was the expected price of war. But what he absolutely could not, would not tolerate was being shown mercy, and then having that mercy thrown back in his face through rebellion. That was not a military or political problem. That was personal.
When Tamerlane returned to Isfahan, he did not come to reoccupy the city. He came to make an unforgettable, definitive example that would echo through history forever. His orders to his massive army were chillingly specific and absolutely bone-numbing. He commanded a general massacre, which was terrible enough on its own, but he then added a devastating layer: the quota system that instantly transformed his soldiers into frenzied hunting parties. Each military unit was commanded to return with a specific, verified number of severed heads. Not prisoners, not bodies, heads. The army swept through Isfahan like a destructive tidal wave. Soldiers went door to door, violently dragging people into the streets. Men, women, and children were all targets. The quota was entirely indiscriminate. The relentless killing continued for days. Chroniclers describe the streets flowing with so much blood that it formed literal streams and pools. The city must have been deafeningly loud with the constant screaming. While contemporary sources exaggerate the death toll to 200,000, modern historians suggest a more plausible but still horrific figure of around 70,000 casualties. Regardless of the exact number, it remains an act of incomprehensible, systematic mass murder. But the killing was only the first chapter of Isfahan's nightmare. Tamerlane had precise plans for every single one of those severed heads. He ordered his men to meticulously collect them all. Tens of thousands of human heads piled high in the public streets. The stench was unbearable, the swarm of flies constant. And then he issued an order that still seems impossible to believe. He commanded his army, "Build towers with them." His soldiers then meticulously constructed giant ghastly pyramids of human skulls. Think about that terrible image for a moment. Not monuments to the dead, but horrific, grotesque monuments made from the dead. Human beings reduced entirely to base construction material. One eyewitness chronicler, a veteran who had seen untold amounts of medieval carnage, attempted to count them. He documented 28 of these towering structures before he literally, physically, could not continue. The chronicler recorded that each tower contained approximately 1,500 heads, and that he became too mentally and physically ill to complete his task. The sight, the persistent smell, the sheer overwhelming magnitude of the horror finally broke him. Even allowing for the common exaggeration of medieval chroniclers, we are still discussing dozens of enormous structures built from human skulls, standing proudly throughout a major, sophisticated city. These monuments were not hidden away in a remote field. They were deliberately, strategically placed in prominent public spaces, at the main city gates, in the central squares, dominating major intersections. They were constructed to be seen by everyone. Tamerlane ensured that every person who dared to enter Isfahan, every passing traveler, every merchant on the Silk Road, would see, without fail, the ultimate consequence of defying him. And it worked perfectly. The skull towers of Isfahan instantly became legendary. They stood for years, some sources claim decades, slowly decaying, but serving as an omnipresent, terrifying reminder of Tamerlane's vengeance. Parents told their children terrifying cautionary tales about the towers. Merchants described them with abject horror. Military commanders across the globe referenced them when debating the merits of resistance versus surrender.
Isfahan had gambled that they could successfully rebel after surrendering, believing Tamerlane would be too distant or too preoccupied to respond fully. They were wrong, and the crushing price was paid not just by those who actively participated in the uprising, but by the entire civilian population, who were transformed into architectural warnings to never, ever cross Tamerlane again. But if you think towers of human skulls represent the absolute pinnacle of Tamerlane's calculated brutality, you are mistaken. We are not yet finished, because what he did to the great city of Delhi makes even the horror of Isfahan appear almost restrained by comparison. By 1398, Tamerlane had successfully conquered the vast majority of Central Asia and Persia. He was now in his 60s, an advanced age by medieval standards. But his ravenous appetite for conquest and destruction remained undiminished. His formidable gaze now turned south, toward the legendary wealth and splendor of India. The powerful Delhi Sultanate ruled northern India at the time. It was immensely rich, politically powerful, and, in Tamerlane's ruthless opinion, far too soft and complacent. His official, stated justification for this massive invasion, that the Muslim sultans of Delhi were not being sufficiently harsh toward their immense Hindu subject population. This, of course, was merely religious rhetoric designed to mask his true motive, which was pure, unadulterated wealth and expansion. Tamerlane himself ruled an empire that included large populations of non-Muslims, whom he taxed but did not systematically persecute. This invasion was purely about wealth and conquest.
Tamerlane assembled an immense army, reportedly over 90,000 soldiers, and began his destructive march through northern India. Crucially, this was not a clean, traditional military campaign, with armies meeting decisively on open battlefields. This was a sustained, rolling apocalypse. As Tamerlane's forces systematically moved through the Indian countryside, they plundered every resource. Villages were immediately razed, crops were mercilessly burned, anyone who dared to offer resistance was instantly killed, and anyone who did not resist was taken captive to be sold into the massive slave markets. The army was so shockingly effective at this systematic looting and capture that they quickly encountered a massive, unforeseen logistical problem. They had too many prisoners. Historical accounts claim that Tamerlane's forces had successfully captured around 100,000 Hindu prisoners by the time they reached the outskirts of Delhi. Think about the military and logistical headache this posed. That is 100,000 human beings who had to be constantly guarded, fed, and prevented from escaping. An entire city's worth of unhappy, starving captives, all traveling sluggishly with the main army. Tamerlane assessed this untenable situation and immediately saw a critical tactical liability. He was on the verge of facing the main Sultan's army in what would be the decisive military engagement of the entire campaign. The absolute last thing he needed was 100,000 prisoners potentially rebelling or even just attempting to flee behind his lines in the heat of the battle. So, he made a decision that perfectly encapsulates his cold, utterly calculating brutality. Kill them all. In a single horrifying day, Tamerlane issued the order for the systematic execution of an estimated 100,000 prisoners. Not prisoners taken in the chaos of battle, not while they were actively resisting or rebelling, just a systematic, brutal mass execution.
The contemporary chroniclers describe Tamerlane's entire camp being transformed into a vast industrial slaughterhouse, with soldiers spending hours simply killing unarmed people. The ground became so completely soaked with blood that it turned into thick, impassable mud. Try to fully comprehend that figure, 100,000 people. That is more than the total fatalities in most major wars. And this happened in a single day, entirely before the actual battle had even commenced. Then, on December 17, 1398, Tamerlane faced the Sultan's army outside Delhi. This is where we see not only his profound brutality, but also his undeniable tactical genius. Because the Sultan possessed a critical secret weapon, 120 massive war elephants. These were not just large animals, they were covered head to toe in chainmail armor and possessed deadly, poisoned blades attached to their mighty tusks. They were, quite literally, the medieval equivalent of modern tanks, specifically designed to shatter enemy formations and cause absolute, total chaos. The Sultan was supremely confident that these elephants would guarantee victory. But Tamerlane, having done his meticulous intelligence work, knew all about the elephants, and he devised a tactical plan that sounds utterly insane, yet apparently worked to devastating effect. According to multiple historical sources, Tamerlane deliberately loaded his baggage camels with highly flammable hay and dried grass. Then, as the Sultan's mighty elephant corps charged forward, he commanded his men to set the camels on fire and drive the screaming, panicked, flaming animals directly into the oncoming elephants. Imagine being a trained war elephant and suddenly you are facing dozens of terrified, screaming, flaming camels running right at you. The elephants instantly panicked. They broke formation, turned, and stampeded uncontrollably back through their own army, trampling hundreds of the Sultan's soldiers. The battle instantly devolved into a chaotic rout, and Delhi's remaining defenders completely collapsed. The city was now utterly defenseless. What followed was 5 full days of organized, systematic devastation that makes everything we have discussed so far appear almost mild by comparison. This was not the simple rage of a fighting force. This was not mere revenge. This was methodical, systematic, industrialized destruction. Tamerlane's soldiers swept through Delhi in disciplined, organized units. Every single neighborhood was targeted. Citizens were massacred everywhere, in the streets, inside their homes, even in the mosques where they had desperately sought sanctuary. Chroniclers recorded blood flowing through the city streets like literal rivers. The smoke generated by the systematic burning of buildings was so thick that it reportedly completely blocked out the sun.
The plundering was just as methodical. Every valuable item was systematically stripped. Gold, precious jewels, luxurious silk, expensive spices. Skilled artisans were immediately taken captive and marched away to work as slaves in Tamerlane's capital. Beautiful young women and men were taken for the slave markets. The immense libraries were burned to ash. The ancient monuments were deliberately vandalized. The contemporary accounts describe a scene that sounds genuinely apocalyptic. One horrified chronicler wrote that the stench of the countless rotting corpses became so utterly overwhelming that Delhi had to be completely abandoned. Survivors fled into the surrounding countryside. The city, once one of the great capitals of the medieval world, was reduced to a desolate, empty ghost town of ruins and corpses. But Tamerlane was not done making his final point. Remember those 120 war elephants that had panicked and caused the rout? The powerful beasts that were intended to be the Sultan's ultimate weapon? Tamerlane successfully captured 90 of them. And in a final, profound act of dominance that perfectly encapsulates his ruthless psychology, he didn't kill them. He put them to work. He forcibly made the elephants, once symbols of Indian majesty and power, haul massive stones all the way back to his capital city of Samarkand. There they would be used as simple beasts of burden to help build a new, magnificent mosque celebrating Tamerlane's glory. It was an act of combined humiliation, pragmatism, and total dominance. The perfect Tamerlane move. The destruction of Delhi was so complete, so profound, that it took the city over a century to recover fully. Think about that. Children born the day Tamerlane left Delhi would die of old age before the city was finally rebuilt. But we are not yet done. Tamerlane had one final city to destroy, one final crowning act of horror that would definitively cement his legacy as perhaps the most brutally creative and effective conqueror in all of human history. And this time, he was going to ruthlessly combine all of his previous methods, the technicality, the erasure, the quotas, the destruction, into one final devastating masterpiece of terror. That city was Baghdad, the legendary metropolis. For 5 long centuries, it had served as the undisputed intellectual, cultural, and spiritual heart of Islamic civilization. A global center of advanced learning, science, art, and high culture. By 1401, Baghdad had declined somewhat from its absolute golden age, but it still remained a city of immense historical significance, immense wealth, and great pride. Tamerlane had actually already conquered Baghdad once before, and the city had initially submitted. But while Tamerlane was busy campaigning across Anatolia, Baghdad's former ruler managed to retake control of the city. When Tamerlane received this news, his reaction was predictably volcanic. This was not just a political rebellion. This was a city that had given its surrender, accepted his imposed rule, and then brazenly switched sides the very moment his back was turned. He returned to Baghdad with a focused, burning vengeance. By this point, he had flawlessly perfected his methods of terror. After a determined, grueling 40-day siege, his forces finally breached the walls, and Tamerlane issued an order that would result in one of history's most terrifying and systematic massacres.
He implemented the quota system that had devastated Isfahan, but on an exponentially larger, more systematic, and more brutal scale. Every single soldier in his vast army, and we are talking about literally tens of thousands of fighting men, was given an individual mandatory quota. Return with a minimum of 2 severed heads. Not 1, 2, minimum. Think about the profound psychological impact of that specific order.
It instantly transformed the chaotic act of a massacre into a terrifying, mandatory competition. It created immense pressure on every soldier to not just kill, but to kill multiple people and provide immediate, verifiable proof of the act. Because if you failed to meet your mandatory quota, you would face the brutal, personal punishment of your commander. And given the atrocities Tamerlane inflicted on his enemies, imagine the fear of his own men who dared to fail him. The soldiers of Tamerlane's army fanned out through Baghdad like a plague of locusts. They went street by street, house by house, hunting for people. Because of the absolute strictness of the quota system, they could not afford to be selective. They couldn't just kill documented rebels or armed combatants. They needed heads, plural, and they needed them fast. The death toll estimates from this horrific event vary wildly, ranging anywhere from 20,000 to over 90,000 people. The definitive truth is likely somewhere in that range, but the exact figure is almost secondary at this point. What matters most is understanding the sheer terrifying frenzy of violence that the quota system deliberately engineered. Contemporary chroniclers describe scenes of absolute personalized horror. Soldiers violently breaking down doors and dragging out entire families. Citizens desperately trying to hide in wells, in cramped attics, in underground crypts, anywhere they thought they might escape the mandatory count. The streets quickly became completely impassable due to the massive piles of corpses. But here is where the story of Baghdad becomes even more disturbing, if that is even possible. The quota was so rigidly enforced, and the fear of failing to meet it was so cripplingly intense, that soldiers began committing acts of utter desperation. They started ruthlessly killing their own captives, valuable slaves they could have easily sold for immense profit, just to meet the required count. Some chilling, though possibly exaggerated sources even claim that soldiers who simply could not find enough victims in the completely emptied city resorted to murdering their own camp followers or even their own wives to meet the terrifying two-head requirement. That last detail may be wartime propaganda or exaggeration, but the very fact that chroniclers found it entirely believable speaks volumes about the atmosphere of mandatory, relentless violence Tamerlane had meticulously created. The killing had become so systematic, so mandatory, that literally nothing was off limits.
But of course, the heads were not merely discarded. This is Tamerlane we are talking about. He had a precise plan, just as he had in Isfahan. The severed heads were meticulously collected and then used to construct terrifying skull towers, but this time on a scale that completely dwarfed even that earlier horror. Some sources sensationally claim there were 120 of these skull towers erected throughout Baghdad. Even if that number is inflated, we are talking about dozens of these immense, silent monuments to mass death. The towers were strategically placed at every major intersection, at all the city gates, and dominating public squares. Each one represented hundreds or even thousands of people who had been alive just days before. The lingering stench must have been utterly unbearable, the sight permanently scarring to anyone who witnessed it. Tamerlane also gave the final order for the utter destruction of Baghdad's remaining great public buildings. Libraries, once full of priceless manuscripts, were violently burned. Palaces were brutally torn down. The entire physical infrastructure of one of history's greatest cities was systematically dismantled. Interestingly, he spared the existing religious sites, the mosques and shrines. This was not an act of sudden respect. It was a cold, final, strategic move. He wanted people to clearly see that he was not waging a war against Islam itself. He was waging a terrifying, total war against disobedience. The religious buildings stood as lonely, defiant monuments in a vast sea of ruins, emphasizing the final message: God's houses may remain. Everything else is forfeit to Tamerlane's vengeance. Baghdad, much like Delhi and Urgench before it, was left a hollow, ruined shell of its former self. The survivors fled desperately into the countryside. The immense economy collapsed entirely. The centuries-old cultural legacy was fundamentally shattered. And the terrible towers of skulls stood for years, a constant, silent warning to any subsequent ruler or citizen who might ever dare to consider defying Tamerlane again.